A little boy gave a sandwich to a homeless man. Days later, the police showed up at his door. In the heart of Millbrook, a quaint suburban town known for its picturesque streets and tight-knit community, lived 8-year-old Ethan Parker. With a mop of unruly brown curls and eyes that sparkled with curiosity, Ethan was the kind of child who noticed everything and questioned even more. His parents, Sarah and Michael Parker, had instilled in him a deep sense of empathy and kindness from an early age. Sarah, a pediatric nurse at the local hospital, spent her days caring for children less fortunate than her own. Her gentle nature and patience had clearly rubbed off on Ethan, who often accompanied her to charity events and food drives. Michael, a high school history teacher, believed in the power of education to change lives. He encouraged Ethan's inquisitive nature, always ready with an answer or a book to satisfy his son's endless questions about the world. The Parkers lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, its white picket fence and well-tended garden a testament to their pride in their home. Ethan's favorite spot was the bay window in the living room, where he would perch for hours, watching the world go by and waving at neighbors. Just down the street from the Parkers lived Officer James Hendricks, a veteran of the Millbrook Police Department. At 45, Hendricks was known for his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement and his unwavering belief in rules and order. His neatly pressed uniform and polished badge were as much a part of him as his steely gaze and firm handshake. Hendricks had moved to Millbrook 15 years ago, following a difficult divorce. He threw himself into his work, quickly rising through the ranks to become one of the most respected officers in the department. However, his dedication to the job often left little room for personal connections, and many in the community found him intimidating and unapproachable. The town of Millbrook itself was a study in contrasts. While its tree-lined streets and well-maintained parks spoke of prosperity, there were pockets of poverty that many of its residents preferred to ignore. The abandoned factory on the outskirts of town had become a makeshift shelter for a small homeless population, a reality that made many of Millbrook's more affluent citizens uncomfortable. It was against this backdrop that Ethan's story would unfold. A tale that would challenge the town's perceptions, test long-held beliefs, and ultimately bring about unexpected change. As the summer sun rose over Millbrook on a warm Tuesday morning, none of its residents could have predicted how a simple act of kindness from a little boy would set in motion a series of events that would touch the lives of everyone in the community. The day that would change everything started like any other for Ethan Parker. He woke up early, wolfed down a bowl of cereal, and kissed his mom goodbye as she left for her morning shift at the hospital. His dad, preparing for a day of summer school classes, ruffled Ethan's hair and reminded him to be good for Mrs. Gonzalez, their elderly neighbor who watched him when both parents were at work. As Ethan settled into his usual spot by the bay window, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A man he had never seen before was shuffling down the sidewalk, his weather-beaten face partially hidden by a scraggly beard. The man's clothes were tattered and dirty, and he carried all his possessions in a worn backpack. Ethan watched, fascinated, as the stranger made his way slowly past the neat houses of Maple Street. Without thinking, Ethan jumped up and ran to the kitchen. He quickly assembled a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, wrapped it in a napkin, and grabbed a juice box from the fridge. His father, engrossed in reviewing his lesson plans, barely noticed as Ethan slipped out the front door. "Excuse me, mister," Ethan called out, running down the sidewalk. The man turned, startled by the child's voice. Up close, Ethan could see the wariness in the stranger's eyes, the deep lines etched into his face by hardship and time. "I thought you might be hungry," Ethan said, holding out the sandwich and juice box. "It's peanut butter and jelly. That's my favorite." The man stared at Ethan for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, young man," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "It's been a long time since anyone's shown me such kindness." As the man gratefully accepted the food, neither he nor Ethan noticed Officer Hendricks watching the interaction from his patrol car parked across the street. Hendricks frowned, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his radio. He had been receiving complaints about homeless people in the area, And here was one, right in the heart of their neighborhood, interacting with a child no less. Ethan, oblivious to the officer's scrutiny, chatted animatedly with the homeless man. "I'm Ethan. What's your name?" "Frank," the man replied, a small smile softening his weathered features. "Frank Dillard." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Frank," Ethan said politely. "Do you live around here?" Frank's smile faltered. "Not exactly, son. I've fallen on some hard times." Before Frank could elaborate, Officer Hendricks stepped out of his car. "Is everything all right here?" he called out, his tone authoritative. Frank stiffened, quickly backing away from Ethan. "No trouble, officer. I was just leaving." Ethan, confused by the sudden tension, looked between Frank and Officer Hendricks. "We were just talking," he explained. "I gave Mr. Frank a sandwich because he looked hungry." Hendricks approached, his face stern. "That's very kind of you, son, but you shouldn't talk to strangers. It's not safe." He turned to Frank. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. We've had complaints about loitering in this area." Frank nodded resignedly, clutching the sandwich and juice box to his chest. "I understand, officer. Thank you again, Ethan. You're a good kid." With that, he shuffled away, disappearing around the corner. Ethan watched him go, a mixture of confusion and sadness on his face. But Officer Hendricks, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just hungry. Hendricks sighed, his expression softening slightly. "I know you meant well, Ethan, but there are rules we have to follow to keep everyone safe. Now, run along home. And remember, no more talking to strangers." As Ethan trudged back to his house, his excitement from moments ago replaced by a heaviness he didn't quite understand, he was unaware of the ripple effect his simple act of kindness had set in motion. Officer Hendricks watched the boy go, a nagging sense of unease settling in his chest. Something about the interaction didn't sit right with him, but he pushed the feeling aside. Rules were rules, after all. Little did either of them know that this brief encounter on a sunny summer morning would lead to events that would challenge their perceptions, test their beliefs, and ultimately change their lives and the entire town of Millbrook forever. In the days following Ethan's encounter with Frank, life in Millbrook seemed to return to normal. Ethan, however, couldn't shake the memory of the kind-eyed homeless man and the sadness he'd seen in Frank's face when Officer Hendricks had sent him away. The boy found himself watching the street more intently, hoping to catch another glimpse of Frank, but the man never reappeared. Meanwhile, Officer Hendricks was dealing with his own internal conflict. The image of Ethan's disappointed face haunted him, challenging his black and white view of law enforcement. As he patrolled the streets of Millbrook, he found himself paying more attention to the homeless individuals he encountered, noticing details he'd previously overlooked. The exhaustion in their eyes, the way they flinched when he approached, the meager possessions they clung to. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Hendricks was called to the local supermarket to deal with a shoplifting incident. When he arrived, he found the store manager firmly gripping the arm of a sodden, desperate-looking man. With a jolt, Hendricks recognized Frank Dillard. This bum was trying to steal food, the manager spat, shoving Frank towards Hendricks. "I want him arrested." Hendricks looked at Frank, taking in his trembling form and the fear in his eyes. Then he noticed what Frank had attempted to steal, a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. The same items Ethan had so innocently offered just days before. In that moment, something shifted in Hendricks. Instead of immediately reaching for his handcuffs, he asked Frank, "Why did you do it?" Frank's response was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, officer. I was just so hungry. I've been trying to find work, but without an address." He trailed off, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Hendricks made a split-second decision. "Sir," he addressed the store manager, "I'll handle this. I'll make sure the items are paid for." The manager's jaw dropped. "But, I said I'll handle it," Hendricks repeated firmly, leaving no room for argument. As Hendricks led Frank out of the store, he felt as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. He saw not a criminal or a nuisance, but a human being in desperate need of help. Frank's story poured out. How he'd lost his job, then his home, how he'd been struggling to survive on the streets of Millbrook, invisible to most of its residents. Hendricks listened, really listened, for the first time in years. He thought of Ethan's simple act of kindness, of the boy's instinctive compassion that he, an officer sworn to protect and serve, had dismissed. Shame and determination warred within him. "Frank," Hendricks said as they reached his patrol car, "I can't pretend this problem doesn't exist anymore, and I can't solve it alone, but I think I know someone who might be able to help us start." As Hendricks drove towards Maple Street, his mind raced with possibilities. He realized that in trying to maintain order, he'd lost sight of the very people he was meant to protect. It was time for a change, and it would start with a visit to a certain compassionate 8-year-old boy. The revelation struck Hendricks like a thunderbolt. Sometimes it took the innocence of a child to remind adults of their shared humanity. As he parked in front of the Parker residence, Hendricks knew that what happened next would not only change Frank's life, but the entire town of Millbrook. Officer Hendricks sat in his patrol car for a long moment, gathering his thoughts before approaching the Parker residence. He knew that what he was about to do would go against protocol, possibly even jeopardize his career. But the image of Ethan's kindness, juxtaposed with Frank's desperation, had ignited something within him, a determination to make a real difference. Taking a deep breath, Hendricks stepped out of his car and walked up to the front door, Frank trailing behind him uncertainly. When Ethan answered the door, his eyes widened in surprise, darting between the officer and the homeless man he'd met days ago. "Hello, Ethan," Hendricks said, his voice gentler than the boy had ever heard it. "Is your father home? I need to speak with both of you." Minutes later, Ethan, his father Michael, Officer Hendricks, and Frank were seated in the Parkers' living room. Hendricks explained the situation, watching as Michael's expression shifted from confusion to concern to understanding. "I've realized," Hendricks concluded, "that our town has a problem we've been ignoring for too long, and I think Ethan here might have shown us all a better way to address it." Ethan beamed at the praise, but his father looked skeptical. "Officer, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but how can we help? We're just one family." Hendricks leaned forward, his eyes alight with purpose. "Mr. Parker, you're a teacher. You have influence in this community. What if we started a program, a way for the people of Millbrook to help those who've fallen on hard times? Not just handouts, but real assistance to help them get back on their feet." As the adults discussed possibilities, Ethan piped up, "What if we could give Mr. Frank a job? And a place to stay?" The room fell silent as they considered the boy's simple yet powerful suggestion. Michael looked at his son with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Ethan, it's not that simple." But Hendricks was already nodding. "Actually, it could be. The police department has a budget for community outreach. What if we used some of that to create a transitional housing and employment program?" The excitement in the room was palpable as they began to flesh out the idea. Frank, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I never expected—" "Thank you." As the sun began to set, a plan had taken shape. Hendricks would propose the program to the police chief and the mayor. Michael would rally support among his colleagues at the school and other community leaders. And Ethan, his eyes shining with excitement, volunteered to spread the word among his classmates and their families. However, as Hendricks left the Parker home that evening, he was acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. Implementing such a program would require not just resources, but a fundamental shift in the town's mentality. He knew there would be resistance, maybe even backlash. His fears proved well-founded in the days that followed. When Hendricks presented the idea to Police Chief Roberts, he was met with skepticism and concern. "Hendricks, I understand what you're trying to do," Chief Roberts said, frowning, "but our job is to maintain order, not run a charity. This could open us up to all sorts of liability issues." Undeterred, Hendricks took the proposal to Mayor Linda Thompson. While more receptive, she too had reservations. "It's an admirable idea, Officer Hendricks," she said, "but I'm not sure the taxpayers will approve of their money being used this way, and there are concerns about attracting more homeless individuals to our town." Frustrated but not defeated, Hendricks decided to take a more grassroots approach. He began spending his off-duty hours talking to local business owners, church leaders, and residents about the proposed program. Some were supportive, moved by the story of Ethan's kindness and Frank's struggle. Others were less enthusiastic, worried about the impact on their property values or the character of the town. As word spread about the proposed initiative, the town became divided. Letters poured into the local newspaper, both for and against the idea. Some praised Hendricks and the Parkers for their compassion, while others accused them of being naive and potentially endangering the community. The controversy came to a head at a town hall meeting 2 weeks later. As Hendricks stood before his neighbors, outlining his proposal, he could feel the tension in the room. Supportive murmurs mingled with skeptical whispers and outright objections. Just as the meeting seemed on the verge of devolving into chaos, a small voice piped up from the back of the room. "Excuse me," Ethan said, standing on his chair to be seen. "I just want to say something." The room fell silent as the boy spoke, his words simple but powerful. "My mom and dad always taught me that we should help people who need it. Isn't that what being a community means?" As Ethan's words hung in the air, Hendricks realized that regardless of the outcome, his decision had already set in motion a change in Millbrook. Whether the program was approved or not, the town would never be quite the same. The consequences of his choice, inspired by a child's simple act of kindness, were only beginning to unfold. While the town grappled with Hendricks's proposal, a secondary plot was unfolding in the life of Sarah Parker, Ethan's mother. Sarah had always been passionate about her work as a pediatric nurse, but the recent events had stirred something deeper within her. One evening, as she made her rounds at the hospital, Sarah encountered a situation that would intertwine with the larger narrative unfolding in Millbrook. A young boy, no older than Ethan, had been brought in with his mother. The child was malnourished and showed signs of neglect. As Sarah tended to him, she learned that the family had recently become homeless after the mother lost her job. The parallels to Frank's situation were not lost on Sarah. She found herself staying after her shift, talking with the mother, Jessica, and learning more about the challenges faced by families living on the edge of poverty in their community. Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, Sarah began researching the resources available for struggling families in Millbrook. She was dismayed to discover how limited they were. The local women's shelter was constantly at capacity, and the food bank struggled to meet the growing demand. Sarah decided to take action. She reached out to her colleagues at the hospital, proposing the idea of a free clinic for homeless and low-income families. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many of her fellow nurses and some doctors volunteering their time. As Sarah worked to bring her vision to life, she found an unexpected ally in Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the hospital's administrator. Dr. Rodriguez had been looking for ways to improve the hospital's community outreach, and Sarah's proposal aligned perfectly with her goals. Together, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez began navigating the bureaucratic hurdles involved in setting up the clinic. They secured a space in an unused wing of the hospital, solicited donations of medical supplies from pharmaceutical companies, and began organizing a roster of volunteer medical professionals. However, they soon hit a snag. The hospital board, concerned about potential liability issues and the cost of running the clinic, was hesitant to give their approval. Sarah found herself in a position similar to Officer Hendricks, fighting against institutional inertia and ingrained biases. Undeterred, Sarah decided to gather data to support her case. She spent her free time compiling statistics on the health outcomes of homeless and low-income individuals in their area, demonstrating the long-term cost savings of preventative care and early intervention. As she delved deeper into her research, Sarah uncovered a troubling pattern. Many of the homeless individuals in Millbrook had originally come from neighboring towns, pushed out by hostile policies and lack of support. She realized that the issue was larger than just their town. It was a regional problem that required a coordinated response. This revelation led Sarah to reach out to healthcare professionals in surrounding communities, forming a network of like-minded individuals committed to addressing the healthcare needs of vulnerable populations. As her efforts gained momentum, Sarah found herself becoming a vocal advocate for the homeless and working poor in Millbrook. She began attending city council meetings, speaking passionately about the need for comprehensive support services. Without realizing it, Sarah's work was creating a perfect complement to the program Hendricks was proposing. While he focused on housing and employment, she was addressing the critical healthcare component of the issue. As the day of the final vote on Hendricks' proposal approached, the secondary plot Sarah had set in motion was about to converge with the main narrative, potentially tipping the scales in favor of a more compassionate and holistic approach to addressing homelessness in Millbrook. As the controversy over Hendricks' proposal swirled around Millbrook, an unexpected relationship began to develop between Officer Hendricks and the Parker family, particularly young Ethan. What had started as a chance encounter was slowly evolving into a mentorship of sorts. Hendricks, who had always seen his role as enforcing rules rather than nurturing community relationships, found himself spending more and more time with Ethan and his family. It began with Hendricks stopping by the Parker home to update them on the progress of his proposal. Ethan would eagerly ask questions about police work, his natural curiosity breaking through Hendricks' usually stoic demeanor. Michael Parker, initially wary of the officer's frequent visits, gradually warmed to Hendricks as he saw the positive influence he was having on Ethan. One Saturday afternoon, Hendricks arrived at the Parkers to find Ethan struggling with his bicycle. The chain had come off, and the boy was close to tears in frustration. Without a second thought, Hendricks knelt down beside Ethan and began to show him how to fix the chain. "You see, Ethan," Hendricks explained as they worked, "sometimes things fall apart, but that doesn't mean they can't be fixed. It just takes a little patience and know-how." Ethan looked up at the officer, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "Is that like what you're trying to do for Mr. Frank and the other homeless people?" Hendricks paused, struck by the boy's insight. "Yes, Ethan, that's exactly what we're trying to do." As the weeks passed, Hendricks found himself opening up to the Parkers in a way he hadn't with anyone in years. He shared stories of his own childhood, of the events that had led him to become a police officer, and of the loneliness he'd felt since his divorce. In turn, the Parkers welcomed him into their home, often inviting him to stay for dinner or to watch Ethan's Little League games. Sarah Parker, who had initially been hesitant about Hendricks' involvement in their lives, found herself appreciating the officer's dedication and the gentle way he interacted with Ethan. She saw how Hendricks was slowly changing, becoming more empathetic and community-oriented in his approach to policing. One evening, as Hendricks was leaving after dinner, Sarah pulled him aside. "You know, James," she said, using his first name for the first time, "what you're doing, it's making a real difference. Not just for the town, but for Ethan. He looks up to you." Hendricks felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Sarah. Your family, you've reminded me of why I became a police officer in the first place. To help people, not just enforce laws." As Hendricks' relationship with the Parkers deepened, so did his commitment to the proposed program. He found himself working tirelessly, inspired by Ethan's unwavering belief in the goodness of people and the Parkers' steadfast support. The growing bond between Hendricks and the Parkers didn't go unnoticed in the community. Some saw it as a heartwarming example of community policing, while others viewed it with suspicion, accusing Hendricks of showing favoritism. Hendricks struggled with these conflicting perceptions. He knew that his closeness to the Parkers could be seen as unprofessional, but he couldn't deny the positive impact they were having on his life and his work. The relationship was tested when, during a heated town council meeting, a resident accused Hendricks of being manipulated by the Parkers. "He's lost his objectivity," the man shouted. "How can we trust him to enforce the law fairly?" Hendricks felt a flash of anger, but before he could respond, he felt a small hand slip into his. Ethan had made his way through the crowd to stand beside him. The simple gesture of support grounded Hendricks, reminding him of the larger purpose behind his actions. As the debate raged on, Hendricks realized that his relationship with the Parkers had become a microcosm of the larger change he was trying to bring about in Millbrook. It wasn't just about creating a program to help the homeless. It was about fostering a sense of community, of shared responsibility for one another's well-being. With this realization, Hendricks squeezed Ethan's hand gently and stepped forward to address the crowd, ready to defend not just his proposal, but the new perspective on community and policing that his relationship with the Parkers had helped him discover. The tension in Millbrook had been building for weeks, and it all came to a head on a sweltering summer evening at the final town council meeting. The community center was packed, with people spilling out onto the sidewalk. The air was thick with anticipation and conflicting emotions as Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order. Officer Hendricks stood at the podium, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw familiar faces, supporters and detractors alike. The Parkers sat in the front row, Ethan giving him a thumbs up. In the back, he spotted Frank, clean-shaven and wearing donated clothes, a symbol of the change they were fighting for. As Hendricks began to speak, outlining the proposed program one last time, a commotion erupted at the entrance. A group of protesters pushed their way in, led by Harold Winters, a wealthy real estate developer known for his opposition to the initiative. "This is a mistake," Winters shouted, his face red with anger. "You'll turn our town into a haven for criminals and vagrants." The room erupted into chaos. Supporters of the program began arguing with the protesters, their voices rising above Hendricks' attempts to restore order. Mayor Thompson banged her gavel, calling for calm, but her pleas were drowned out by the cacophony. In the midst of the turmoil, Ethan slipped away from his parents and made his way to the stage. Before anyone could stop him, he had grabbed the microphone. "Please, everyone, listen." The boy's voice, amplified through the speakers, cut through the noise. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the small figure on the stage. "I know you're scared," Ethan continued, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "Change is scary, but being homeless is scarier. My friend Mr. Frank taught me that." He gestured towards Frank, who stood up, visibly moved. "Mr. Frank isn't scary. He's just someone who needs a little help like all of us sometimes. Isn't that what a community is supposed to do? Help each other?" The silence in the room was palpable as Ethan's words sank in. Even Winters seemed taken aback, his anger deflating in the face of the child's simple wisdom. Hendricks stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Ethan's right," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "This isn't about politics or property values. It's about who we are as a community. Are we the kind of people who turn our backs on those in need, or are we the kind who lend a helping hand?" The tension in the room began to shift. People who moments ago had been shouting at each other were now looking at their neighbors with new eyes, as if seeing them for the first time. Sarah Parker stood up, her voice clear and determined. "The free clinic I've been working on isn't just for the homeless," she said. "It's for all of us, because any one of us could be one misfortune away from needing help." Her words seemed to break a dam. Others began to stand, sharing their own stories of hardship and community support. The mood in the room transformed, from one of division to one of shared purpose. As the impromptu testimonials continued, Mayor Thompson leaned over to Hendricks. "I think it's time for the vote," she said quietly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Hendricks nodded, his heart racing. As the mayor called for order and announced the vote, he felt Ethan's small hand slip into his own. Whatever the outcome, he knew that Millbrook had already changed. The real victory wasn't in the program itself, but in the way the community had come together, rediscovering their shared humanity in the process. The vote was cast, and the results were clear. Millbrook would move forward with the homeless assistance program. The decision was met with a mix of cheers and apprehensive murmurs, but the overwhelming sentiment was one of cautious optimism. In the days that followed, Hendricks found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The theoretical program now needed to be transformed into a practical reality, and the challenges were numerous. The first hurdle came in the form of location. The town needed a place to house the program participants, but suitable buildings were scarce. After much debate, it was decided that an old community center on the outskirts of town, long fallen into disuse, would be renovated for this purpose. As volunteers began the process of cleaning and repairing the building, another issue arose. Some of the neighboring residents, concerned about the impact on their property values, filed a petition to block the program. Hendricks, along with Mayor Thompson, spent long hours in negotiations trying to address their concerns while moving the project forward. A compromise was eventually reached. The program would include strict guidelines for participants, including curfews and community service requirements. In return, the town agreed to increase police patrols in the area and invest in beautifying the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Sarah Parker was making progress with the free clinic. She had secured a partnership with the local hospital, allowing the clinic to operate out of a refurbished wing. However, staffing remained a challenge. Many medical professionals were hesitant to volunteer their time, worried about the potential risks and liabilities. Sarah's solution was to organize an open house at the hospital. She invited doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers to meet some of the potential clinic patients, including Frank. Hearing firsthand stories of struggle and resilience helped to change many minds, and by the end of the event, Sarah had a solid roster of volunteers. Ethan, not content to sit on the sidelines, had rallied his classmates to get involved. They organized a clothing and supply drive, collecting donations for the program participants. The school principal, impressed by the students' initiative, incorporated a community service component into the curriculum, ensuring ongoing support for the program. As the pieces began to fall into place, Hendricks turned his attention to perhaps the most crucial aspect of the program: job placement. He reached out to local businesses, trying to secure employment opportunities for program participants. Many were reluctant, citing concerns about reliability and potential theft. It was Frank who provided the breakthrough. He suggested starting a small landscaping business, employing program participants to maintain local parks and public spaces. The idea gained traction, with the town agreeing to contract their services as a starting point. Despite these successes, tensions in the community remained high. The program's opponents, though outvoted, continued to voice their dissatisfaction. Hendricks often found himself mediating disputes and addressing concerns, his days stretching long into the nights. The strain began to show on Hendricks. The once stoic officer was visibly tired, the weight of his responsibilities etching new lines on his face. It was during one particularly difficult day, when it seemed every step forward was met with 2 steps back, that Hendricks found himself questioning whether he had taken on more than he could handle. As he sat in his patrol car, head in his hands, a tap on the window startled him. It was Ethan, his face pressed against the glass, concern evident in his young eyes. Hendricks rolled down the window, managing a weak smile. "Are you okay, Officer Hendricks?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with genuine worry. Hendricks sighed. "It's just been a tough day, Ethan. Sometimes I wonder if we're really making a difference." Ethan's brow furrowed in thought. Then, with the simple wisdom of a child, he said, "But you are making a difference. Remember Mr. Frank? He has a job now, and a place to live. That's a big difference to him." Hendricks felt a lump form in his throat. "You're right, Ethan. Sometimes we need to be reminded of why we're doing this." Encouraged by Ethan's words, Hendricks redoubled his efforts. He organized a town hall meeting, not to debate the program, but to bring people together. He invited program participants to share their stories and community members to voice their concerns in a constructive manner. The meeting was tense at first, but as people began to talk and truly listen to one another, something remarkable happened. Opponents of the program, hearing first-hand accounts of how it was changing lives, began to soften their stance. Supporters gained a better understanding of their neighbors' fears and worked to address them. By the end of the evening, while not everyone was fully convinced, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. People who had entered the hall as adversaries left with a newfound respect for one another. Plans were made for community dinners, where program participants and longtime residents could mingle and get to know each other as individuals, not as stereotypes. As Hendricks locked up the hall that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy, but he was no longer walking it alone. The entire community, in its own messy, imperfect way, was coming together to make this work. The conflict was far from resolved, but a path forward had been cleared. It was a path of dialogue, understanding, and shared responsibility. And as Hendricks looked out over the town he had sworn to protect and serve, he realized that true resolution wasn't about eliminating all disagreement, but about finding a way to move forward together, despite their differences. 6 months after the implementation of the Homeless Assistance Program, Millbrook stood at a crossroads. The initial fervor had died down, replaced by the day-to-day reality of running such an ambitious initiative. While there had been successes, Frank and several others had transitioned into stable jobs and housing, challenges remained. The turning point came unexpectedly. During a routine city council meeting, Mayor Thompson was presenting the program's 6-month report when Councilman Winters, once the program's most vocal opponent, raised his hand to speak. The room tensed, anticipating another critique. But Winters surprised everyone. "I'll admit I was wrong," he began, his voice gruff but sincere. "I've seen the changes in our town. Not just for the homeless, but for all of us. We're a stronger community now." His words sparked a ripple effect. Others began to share their observations. How the community service aspect had brought people together. How the landscaping business started by program participants had beautified the town. How the free clinic had helped not just the homeless, but many working-class families struggling with healthcare costs. As the discussion unfolded, a new vision for Millbrook began to take shape. The Homeless Assistance Program, initially seen as a separate initiative, was reimagined as part of a broader community development plan. Ideas flowed freely, expanding the job training program to include youth internships, turning the renovated community center into a hub for adult education classes, scaling up the landscaping business into a full-fledged social enterprise. Hendricks, listening from his usual spot at the back of the room, felt a surge of emotion. This was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The program wasn't just changing individual lives, it was transforming the entire fabric of the community. As the meeting concluded, Mayor Thompson approached Hendricks with a proposition. "We need someone to coordinate all these new initiatives," she said. "Someone who understands both the law enforcement and community service aspects. Would you consider taking on that role?" Hendricks was stunned. It would mean leaving his position as a police officer, stepping into uncharted territory. But as he looked around the room, saw the excitement on people's faces, his decision became clear. "I'd be honored," he replied. As Hendricks left the city hall that evening, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, but filled with potential. Millbrook was embarking on a new direction, one that prioritized compassion, community, and second chances. And it had all started with a little boy's act of kindness, a sandwich offered to a stranger in need. A year had passed since that fateful day when Ethan offered a sandwich to Frank, setting in motion a chain of events that transformed Millbrook. As the town prepared for the first anniversary celebration of their community initiative, each of the key players found themselves reflecting on their personal journeys. Officer James Hendricks, now the Community Development Coordinator, sat in his new office, surrounded by project plans and thank-you notes from program participants. He marveled at how much he had changed. Once rigid and by the book, he had learned to see the human story behind every rule and statistic. His newfound empathy had not only made him a better leader, but it also brought a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced in his years of traditional policing. "I thought I was protecting the community before," Hendricks mused to himself, "but now I understand what it truly means to serve." Ethan, now 9 years old, had grown too, not just in height, but in maturity and understanding. His innocent act of kindness had blossomed into a passion for community service. He had become a fixture at the community center, often seen reading to younger children or helping with meal preparations. The once shy boy now spoke confidently at school assemblies about the importance of compassion and civic engagement. Sarah Parker had seen her free clinic evolve from a dream to a vital community resource. The challenges had been numerous, but each obstacle overcame had strengthened her resolve. She had become a respected voice in local healthcare policy, advocating for preventive care and mental health services. Looking at the bustling clinic, Sarah felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the facility, but in the way the community had come together to support it. "We're not just treating illnesses," she often said, We're healing our community. Frank Dillard, once homeless and hopeless, now stood tall as the supervisor of the landscaping business he had helped create. The business had expanded, now employing 15 formerly homeless individuals and taking on contracts throughout the county. Frank's journey from recipient of help to provider of opportunities for others gave him a sense of purpose he had thought was lost forever. Every flower we plant, every lawn we mow, Frank would say, is a sign of our community's growth and second chances. Mayor Linda Thompson, initially skeptical of the program, had become its most vocal champion. She had learned valuable lessons about the power of grassroots initiatives and the importance of listening to all voices in the community, especially those often overlooked. Her leadership style had evolved, becoming more inclusive and forward-thinking. Even Harold Winters, once the program's fiercest opponent, had undergone a transformation. His change of heart at that pivotal council meeting had been just the beginning. He had since become an unexpected ally, using his business acumen to help secure funding and partnerships for the community initiatives. Winters found that his newfound reputation as a philanthropist was far more satisfying than his previous image as a hard-nosed developer. As the anniversary celebration approached, each of these individuals reflected on how far they had come. They had all grown in ways they never expected, challenged by circumstances to become better versions of themselves. The program, that began as a controversial initiative to help the homeless, had become a catalyst for personal growth and community transformation. They realized that in trying to lift up the most vulnerable members of their community, they had all been elevated. The compassion they had extended to others had circled back, enriching their own lives in profound and unexpected ways. The day of the anniversary celebration dawned bright and clear. Millbrook's town square was alive with activity. Booths showcasing various community programs, the aroma of a community cookout filling the air, and the sound of laughter and conversation echoing off the buildings. As Ethan stood on the makeshift stage beside Officer Hendricks, Mayor Thompson, his parents, and Frank, he looked out at the crowd gathered before them. People from all walks of life, longtime residents and newcomers, young and old, those who had given help and those who had received it, stood together as one community. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the microphone. "A year ago," she began, "a little boy's act of kindness opened our eyes to the power of compassion. Today, we celebrate not just the success of a program, but the reawakening of our community's spirit." Her words resonated with the crowd, reinforcing the theme that had become Millbrook's new motto: small acts, big changes. As the celebration continued, the story of Millbrook served as a powerful reminder that community transformation often begins with the smallest gestures of kindness. It showed that when people come together, putting aside their differences and fears, remarkable change is possible. The journey of Millbrook, from a town divided to a community united in purpose, stood as a testament to the ripple effect of compassion. It proved that by helping others, we often find the best in ourselves. As the sun set on the celebration, the people of Millbrook looked to the future with hope and determination, knowing that their story was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning.